Labor leaders rallied in Windsor today on the first day of the two-week shutdown at the Windsor Assembly Plant.
Well, thousands of auto workers in Windsor are at home this morning instead of work on the first day of the two-week shutdown at one of Ontario's largest auto operations, the Windsor Stellantis auto plant.
Workers are concerned, obviously, when they made the announcement that they were going to shut for a couple of weeks. It's not the fact that we have a two-week shutdown in place.
Best Western Plus employees walked off the job over the weekend. They're striking after negotiations between their union, Unifor Local 195, and the downtown Windsor Hotel broke down.
For decades, union workers believed that voting for pro-labor politicians would protect their jobs and their futures. That belief just got shattered by the biggest act of labor betrayal in American history. 3,000 United Auto Workers members discovered that their own government was funding their unemployment. The union dues they paid, the political candidates they supported, the strikes they endured, all of it meaningless when foreign governments offer bigger bribes than American workers can afford. But how did they do it? How many other American industries are being sold off while you sleep? And what does this mean to you? Stick around, because everything has become collateral damage in a political game where American workers always lose. Canada's electric vehicle gold rush. Your tax dollars weren't just subsidizing cars, they were financing surrender. The suspension at Windsor Assembly wasn't an isolated business decision. It was the visible crack in a 15 billion Canadian dollar gamble that had been brewing behind closed doors. The federal government in Ottawa had committed $10 billion to keep Stellantis operations in Canada. The Ontario provincial government added another $5 billion. Combined, this represented the largest single subsidy package in Canadian automotive history. The money wasn't just flowing, it was flooding. Volkswagen had already secured 13 billion Canadian dollars for their St. Thomas battery plant. Honda was finalizing a $15 billion expansion package. LG Energy Solution Partnerships were promising 45 gigawatt hours of annual battery production capacity. Canada wasn't just competing for automotive investment, it was buying it. The Stellantis LG Energy Solution Nexstar battery plant in Windsor represented the crown jewel of this strategy. 2,500 promised jobs, $5 billion in initial investment. Technology transfer agreements that would position Canada as the dominant North American hub for electric vehicle production. Parliamentary sessions in Ottawa buzzed with talk of industrial policy transformation. The Prime Minister had personally toured the Windsor operations, promising that Canada would not be left behind in the electric vehicle revolution. The rhetoric was ambitious, but the financial commitment was unprecedented. The consequences would reshape continental manufacturing. The secret negotiations nobody saw coming. What if the biggest automotive deal wasn't made in boardrooms, but bureaucratic backrooms? While American attention focused on tariff threats and trade rhetoric, Canadian officials were quietly executing a strategy that had been years in the making. The subsidy negotiations didn't happen in public speeches. They unfolded in secure government buildings where civil servants crafted terms that would fundamentally alter North American automotive production. Mark Carney stood before Parliament and delivered a message that would echo across the continent. We did not steal American manufacturing. We built what America refused to build. The statement wasn't just political posturing. It was a declaration of economic independence. The Canadian approach differed fundamentally from American industrial policy. While Washington struggled with infrastructure bills and partisan gridlock, Ottawa offered streamlined environmental approvals, guaranteed energy pricing, and workforce training programs aligned with industry needs. The contrast was striking. One system designed for speed, the other mired in complexity. Doug Ford, Ontario's premier, had been instrumental in securing provincial contributions. His meetings with Stellantis executives emphasized stability and certainty, qualities that had become increasingly rare in American automotive policy. The negotiations revealed something profound about how modern manufacturing decisions are made. Political stability mattered more than labor costs. Meanwhile, across the Detroit River, something bigger was happening. Detroit's reckoning arrives. The announcement didn't come from Stellantis. It came from silence. Michigan's automotive community woke up to discover that 40 years of partnership, investment, and shared prosperity could disappear overnight. The United Auto Workers leadership called emergency sessions. Congressional representatives demanded explanations that corporate executives couldn't provide. The Detroit 3 automakers realized that their carefully constructed North American supply chains were more fragile than anyone had imagined. Generational automotive families found themselves questioning loyalties that had defined their identities. These weren't just jobs, they were cultural inheritance. Fathers had taught sons to weld. Mothers had trained daughters in quality control. The suspension represented an erasure of community identity that couldn't be measured in dollars or employment statistics. Regional economic projections painted a grim picture. Supplier networks throughout the Great Lakes region faced contract cancellations. Transportation companies lost shipping routes. Cross-border trade relationships that had seemed permanent suddenly appeared temporary. Congressional offices fielded angry calls from constituents who couldn't understand how American brands could abandon American workers. Local television stations broadcast interviews with families facing financial uncertainty. The financial documents revealed something unprecedented. The 25% nuclear option. The tariffs weren't just trade policy. They were economic warfare with friendly fire. President Donald Trump's announcement of 25% automotive tariffs on Canadian and Mexican imports wasn't subtle diplomacy. It was a declaration of economic war against America's closest trading partners. The policy, implemented in March 2025, promised to protect American manufacturing jobs by making foreign production prohibitively expensive. The reality proved far more devastating. Stellantis responded within hours. The company announced immediate production halts at both Canadian and Mexican facilities, citing uncertainty in the current environment. 900 American workers at supporting plants received layoff notices. 4,500 Canadian workers faced indefinite furloughs. The tariffs designed to bring jobs home had instead eliminated them entirely. Corporate executives found themselves in an impossible position. The tariffs made cross-border production financially unviable, but the integrated supply chains couldn't be rebuilt overnight. Components manufactured in Mexico, assembled in Canada, and shipped to the United States represented decades of optimization that couldn't be reversed with policy announcements. The automotive industry had warned about these consequences, but political rhetoric had overwhelmed economic reality. Manufacturing wasn't just about final assembly, it was about supply chain relationships that spanned continents. Now the entire North American supply chain hung in balance. We broke down complex international trade agreements, corporate financial filings, and subsidy packages to show you exactly how your tax dollars funded American job destruction. You just got a masterclass in economic warfare that business schools don't teach. Subscribe if this analysis saved you hours of confusion. The pickup truck paradox. How do you protect American jobs by destroying American products? The irony was devastating and immediate. Rural Republican voters, Trump's most loyal supporters, faced the steepest price increases from policies designed to help them. Pickup trucks, the quintessentially American vehicle, depended heavily on Canadian and Mexican production. The Ram heavy-duty trucks built in Saltillo, Mexico, suddenly carried thousands of dollars in additional costs. Construction contractors watched equipment costs soar, just as infrastructure projects promised economic revival. Small business owners who depended on fleet vehicles faced budget crises that threatened their operations. The vehicles that symbolized American independence had become casualties of American protectionism. Pickup trucks represented 20% of the total automotive market, with nearly 3 million sold annually. Republican voters were twice as likely to own trucks compared to Democrats. The political coalition that had demanded trade protection was experiencing the policy's harshest consequences. Ford's F-Series trucks, assembled in the United States, seemed initially protected. However, Canadian engine production meant that even American vehicles carried foreign content that triggered additional costs. The interconnected nature of modern manufacturing made pure domestic production virtually impossible. Dealership lots across truck-dependent regions began showing inventory shortages within weeks. Construction industry associations issued urgent statements about project cost increases. Rural communities that had enthusiastically supported trade policy reform found themselves bearing its primary costs. Deep within corporate boardrooms, Stellantis chooses sides. The decision wasn't about tariffs, it was about trust. Chairman John Elkann faced a choice that would define Stellantis' future in North America. The European parent company had invested billions in continental operations, but political instability threatened the foundation of those investments. Internal communications showed executives questioning whether the United States remained a reliable partner for long-term manufacturing strategy. The company's response was swift and decisive. Production halts weren't temporary adjustments, they were strategic repositioning. Canadian government officials had provided written guarantees about subsidy continuation and regulatory stability. American officials offered threats and uncertainty. Stellantis controlled iconic American brands, Jeep, Ram, Dodge, Chrysler, but its headquarters in Amsterdam prioritized global market access over national loyalty. European shareholders demanded explanations for North American political risk exposure. The company had concluded that political unpredictability represented an unacceptable business risk. Mexican facilities in Saltillo and Toluca continued operations, serving Latin American markets that offered growth potential without political complications. Canadian plants provided access to both domestic markets and international trade relationships that remained stable. American operations increasingly seemed like legacy commitments rather than future opportunities. The internal memos exposed the real strategy: Washington's policy meltdown. The government wasn't just losing jobs, it was losing credibility. Congressional Republicans faced an impossible political situation. Supporting the tariffs meant defending policies that were eliminating jobs in their districts. Opposing them meant contradicting a president whose base demanded trade protection. The party unity that had characterized early Trump administration trade policy began fracturing under economic reality. Rust Belt senators found themselves fielding angry calls from constituents who had supported trade reform, but now faced unemployment. House Democrats discovered that the economic damage extended beyond political calculations. Labor unions were split between supporting American manufacturing and protecting existing jobs. White House damage control efforts struggled with the complexity of modern supply chains. Simple slogans about American manufacturing couldn't address the reality of integrated continental production. Presidential advisors who had promised easy victories through trade policy discovered that economic relationships were more fragile than anticipated. Department of Labor officials dispatched to meet with regional leaders found themselves defending policies they couldn't fully explain. Industry lobbyists who had initially supported targeted trade measures watched their carefully crafted positions collapse into chaos. Congressional staffers reported unprecedented volumes of constituent communications, with small business owners demanding explanations for cost increases that threatened their survival. The reverberations would reach every American family. When loyalty dies, the betrayal wasn't just corporate, it was personal. Third-generation automotive families discovered that decades of loyalty meant nothing when spreadsheets dictated strategy. Michael Rodriguez had followed his father and grandfather into the Windsor assembly plant, believing that skilled work and dedication would provide lifelong security. The production suspension didn't just threaten his paycheck, it shattered fundamental assumptions that had guided his family's choices. United Auto Workers members gathered in union halls that had witnessed decades of negotiations and celebrations. The conversations weren't about wage increases. They were about survival. Workers who had weathered plant closures, automation, and overseas competition discovered that the greatest threat came from their own government's policies. Military veterans working in automotive plants felt a particular sting. They had served their country and then built vehicles for American families. The production suspension represented a double betrayal by corporations that wrapped themselves in patriotic rhetoric while relocating operations, and by politicians who claimed to support working families while implementing policies that eliminated their jobs. Identity crises extended beyond individual workers to entire communities. The cultural traditions surrounding automotive work, the pride in American manufacturing, the satisfaction of building quality products were being systematically destroyed by policies supposedly designed to protect them. Across the Canadian border, Unifor's strategic victory. What happens when foreign workers benefit from American corporate decisions? Lana Payne, Unifor national president, faced an unprecedented situation. Her Canadian union members were simultaneously victims and beneficiaries of the same international crisis. The Windsor assembly plant suspension threatened thousands of Canadian jobs, but the broader subsidy strategy promised long-term employment security that American workers lacked. Cross-border labor solidarity emerged as a powerful response to corporate manipulation. Unifor and United Auto Workers leaders held emergency conferences that transcended national boundaries. Canadian workers offered support to American counterparts, facing uncertainty. Union communications revealed unprecedented cooperation between organizations that had traditionally competed for investment and jobs. The strategic victory wasn't just about preserving jobs. It was about reshaping labor relations across North America. Canadian workers had secure government backing for their industries. American workers faced political volatility that made long-term planning impossible. International union cooperation expanded beyond automotive manufacturing. Workers in steel, aluminum, energy, and transportation industries recognized that their fates were interconnected. Cross-border solidarity became both practical necessity and political strategy. Worker cultural exchanges expanded into mutual support networks. Canadian locals offered resources and advice to American counterparts. The international crisis was creating international labor cooperation. The union communications revealed unprecedented cooperation. The dealership desert. The lots weren't just empty. They were abandoned. Jeep dealerships across America transformed from bustling retail centers into automotive ghost towns. Showrooms that had displayed dozens of vehicles contained a handful of remaining models with price tags that reflected scarcity rather than competition. Sales staff who had built careers on customer relationships found themselves explaining shortages they couldn't resolve. Customer frustration escalated from disappointment to anger as waiting lists stretched months into the future. Families needing reliable transportation discovered that American brands were no longer readily available. Jeep's reputation for rugged dependability became meaningless when vehicles couldn't be purchased at any price. Family-owned dealerships that had served communities for generations faced financial collapse. Floor plan financing required payments regardless of inventory availability. Service departments lost revenue as new vehicle sales disappeared. Franchise owners who had invested life savings in brand partnerships watched their businesses become unsustainable. The Jeep Wrangler, America's most iconic off-road vehicle, vanished from dealer lots just as outdoor recreation season approached. Rural communities that depended on capable four-wheel drive vehicles for work and recreation faced transportation crises that extended beyond personal inconvenience to economic necessity. Sales staff trained on Jeep features found their expertise worthless without products to sell. Customer service departments fielded endless inquiries about delivery dates that nobody could predict. The retail collapse would trigger something bigger: America's automotive identity crisis. This wasn't just about cars anymore, it was about who we are. Military veterans felt the deepest connection to Jeep's heritage. The brand had literally helped win World War II, carrying American forces across European battlefields and Pacific islands. The suspension of American production felt like abandonment of military tradition and national heritage. Veterans organizations issued statements expressing concern about foreign control of strategically important manufacturing capabilities. Rural families discovered that their transportation needs couldn't be met by urban-focused alternatives. Jeep vehicles had been specifically designed for American conditions, from Rocky Mountain trails to southeastern swamps, from northern winters to desert summers. Foreign manufacturers offered capable vehicles, but they lacked the cultural connection and practical familiarity. Outdoor enthusiasts faced equipment crises that threatened recreational lifestyles. Jeep modifications, accessories, and repair knowledge represented specialized communities built around specific vehicles. The production suspension didn't just eliminate transportation options, it threatened entire subcultures organized around automotive enthusiasm. National security considerations emerged as military and emergency services evaluated their dependence on foreign manufacturing. The corporate relocations raised questions about supply chain security in national emergency situations. Survey results showed declining confidence in American industrial capability. The automotive crisis was becoming a broader national identity crisis about American competitiveness and reliability. Meanwhile, in Ottawa, something big was brewing. Ottawa's master plan revealed, what if Canada wasn't just competing, it was conquering? The Stellantis subsidy package wasn't an isolated policy response. It was the culmination of a strategic plan that had been quietly developing since the early 2020s. Canadian officials had studied the electric vehicle transition and concluded that geography, resources, and political stability would determine winners and losers. They positioned Canada to win. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland stood before international investors and delivered a message that reverberated through global automotive circles. This is the year it's going to be decided which countries have the investments and the great paying jobs that are going to build the green economy. The fair share Canada was claiming represented a fundamental redistribution of North American industrial power. Volkswagen's $13 billion St. Thomas facility would become the largest battery plant in the Western Hemisphere. Honda's $15 billion expansion would establish integrated supply chains from raw materials to finished vehicles. Natural resource advantages provided the foundation for Canada's strategy. The country possessed significant lithium reserves, extensive nickel mining operations, and reliable cobalt supply chains. Unlike other nations that imported critical materials, Canada could develop vertically integrated electric vehicle production. Clean energy grid superiority offered another strategic advantage. Hydroelectric power provided stable, environmentally friendly electricity at costs that competitors couldn't match. Regulatory environment streamlining attracted companies frustrated with complex American approval processes. The mineral wealth maps showed the real advantage. The resource war nobody saw. The electric vehicle revolution wasn't powered by innovation. It was fueled by geography. Canadian critical mineral advantages were staggering in scope and strategic importance. Lithium reserves in Quebec and Ontario could support decades of battery production without foreign dependency. Nickel mining operations in Manitoba and Ontario provided essential battery components that global manufacturers desperately needed. Cobalt supply chains through partnerships with the Democratic Republic of Congo offered reliable access to limited global resources that most countries couldn't secure independently. Resource nationalism strategies were emerging as countries recognized that electric vehicle production required more than manufacturing capability. It demanded control over essential materials that couldn't be substituted or replicated. Canada possessed domestic reserves of nearly every critical mineral necessary for battery production, while competitors depended on unstable international supply chains, vulnerable to political disruption, natural disasters, and price manipulation. Supply chain security became a national security priority as governments realized that electric vehicle adoption would create new dependencies that could be weaponized by hostile nations or exploited by unreliable partners. Countries without domestic mineral resources would remain perpetually vulnerable to supply disruptions, economic coercion, and political pressure from resource-rich nations that controlled their technological futures. Canada's geological advantages translated into geopolitical power that extended far beyond automotive manufacturing. Control over critical minerals meant influence over global technology development, military equipment production, and energy infrastructure deployment. The country was transforming from a resource exporter into a resource controller with unprecedented strategic leverage. Mining communities throughout northern Canada experienced economic renaissance as global demand for critical minerals soared beyond all previous projections. Towns that had struggled with declining populations and limited economic opportunities suddenly became centers of international investment and technological innovation. Indigenous nations participated in development partnerships that provided both substantial economic benefits and enhanced environmental protection through traditional knowledge integration. International buyers competed aggressively for access to Canadian mineral resources, creating bidding wars that increased both prices and strategic leverage for Canadian producers. Asian manufacturers established permanent procurement offices in Toronto and Vancouver to secure priority access. European companies negotiated long-term supply agreements with premium pricing structures. American firms discovered they were competing as foreign buyers for North American resources, paying international market rates for materials extracted from their own continent. Market price influence capabilities gave Canada unprecedented power over global electric vehicle costs and production schedules. Production increases could moderate prices during supply shortages, providing economic relief to allied nations. Production restrictions could pressure competitors during trade disputes, creating powerful diplomatic leverage. The country that had traditionally been a price taker in global commodity markets was rapidly becoming a price maker with significant market control authority. The implications reached far beyond automotive manufacturing and into every sector dependent on battery technology and electric systems. America's industrial surrender. The superpower wasn't just losing factories, it was losing the future. United States electric vehicle market share deteriorated with alarming speed as foreign manufacturers expanded production capacity and American companies systematically relocated operations to more business-friendly environments. Chinese manufacturers like BYD and CATL gained substantial market access through Canadian partnerships that provided North American manufacturing bases. European companies established regional headquarters in Toronto and Montreal, positioning themselves to serve continental markets without depending on American infrastructure or political stability. Industrial policy failure consequences extended far beyond immediate job losses to create long-term competitive disadvantages that would persist for generations. The United States had pioneered electric vehicle technology through innovative companies like Tesla, but manufacturing leadership was rapidly migrating to countries with superior industrial strategies, consistent government support, and integrated supply chain control. Innovation without corresponding production capability provided severely limited economic benefit and no strategic advantage. Competitive advantage erosion patterns were becoming visible across multiple critical industries simultaneously. Semiconductor production had already shifted predominantly to Asia through decades of policy neglect. Battery manufacturing was accelerating toward countries with mineral resources and supportive government policies. Advanced manufacturing capabilities that had historically defined American economic leadership were being systematically relocated to nations that prioritized industrial development over political rhetoric. Economic security implications deeply worried strategic planners who recognized that industrial capacity ultimately determined national power projection capabilities. Military equipment increasingly depended on foreign supply chains that could be disrupted during international conflicts. Critical infrastructure systems relied on imported components manufactured by countries with competing national interests. Energy independence goals became meaningless without domestic manufacturing capacity to produce necessary equipment. American exceptionalism faced harsh reality confrontations as citizens discovered that their country couldn't effectively compete with better organized rivals that prioritized long-term strategic planning over short-term political gains. Educational systems that had comfortably assumed American technological superiority struggled to explain declining performance relative to international competitors. Political leaders who had confidently promised easy victories through tariffs and aggressive rhetoric confronted complex global competition that required sustained effort and sophisticated strategy. Industrial heritage preservation became primarily museum work rather than living tradition passed between generations of skilled workers. Factories that had once symbolized American manufacturing capability and global leadership closed permanently, while technologically superior facilities opened in competitor countries with more supportive business environments. Around the world, economic and political competitors were carefully watching American industrial decline and adjusting their own strategies accordingly. The new continental order, the border didn't disappear. It moved south. North American economic integration was being fundamentally redefined as Canada and Mexico developed increasingly direct partnerships that systematically bypassed traditional American leadership roles. Trade relationships that had automatically assumed American centrality were being strategically restructured around new power centers located in Ottawa and Mexico City. The continent that had been organized entirely around American economic dominance was rapidly developing alternative institutional arrangements that excluded American participation. Canada-Mexico direct partnerships were emerging across critical sectors, including energy development, advanced manufacturing, technology innovation, and resource extraction. Resource flows that had traditionally passed through American corporate intermediaries were discovering more efficient transportation routes and processing systems. Economic relationships were being systematically optimized for continental rather than specifically American benefit, reducing American leverage and influence. United States isolation acceleration genuinely worried strategic planners who clearly recognized that modern economic partnerships were increasingly becoming comprehensive security alliances with military implications. Countries that successfully developed independent supply chains and diversified trade relationships would become substantially less susceptible to American economic pressure and political coercion. Continental leadership was measurably shifting from Washington toward Ottawa and Mexico City through concrete policy coordination. Continental power balance shifts accurately reflected broader global trends toward genuine multipolarity that challenged American hegemonic assumptions. The unipolar moment when American economic dominance seemed naturally permanent was definitively ending through systematic competition from multiple regional powers. Continental arrangements were being replicated globally as countries actively sought viable alternatives to American-centered economic systems that prioritized American interests above partner nation development. Alliance system modifications were becoming clearly visible in international forums where Canada and Mexico increasingly coordinated policy positions independently of American preferences or diplomatic pressure. Economic policies were being synchronized across borders that deliberately excluded the United States from decision-making processes. Trade agreements were being negotiated without American input or participation, reducing American influence over continental economic development. Border community economic adjustments reflected the changing continental relationships as cities that had historically prospered from American economic dominance adapted to new trade flows and alternative partnership arrangements. Transportation networks were being systematically reconfigured to support direct Canada-Mexico commerce that bypassed American intermediaries and reduced American transaction fees. The transformation would reshape everything fundamental about North American economic and political relationships. The electric vehicle revolution that had begun as a technological advancement was becoming a complete reorganization of global economic power structures. Countries with natural resources, strategic foresight, and effective industrial policies were successfully capturing the economic future, while those that depended primarily on political rhetoric and trade threats were discovering that sustainable economic leadership required substantially more than military dominance or historical achievements. The world was decisively moving forward, and America was systematically being left behind. Was this inevitable, or could America have prevented this economic disaster? What industry will Canada target next? Drop your thoughts below, and thanks for watching until the end.